Hey everybody, it's Nick here with you. Welcome back to the channel. The Beatles and Apple Records have finally re-released the long-coveted Let It Be movie directed by Michael Lindsay Hogg that originally came out back in 1970. It's now on Disney Plus for all of us to see. And for this very special rock movie review, I have a very special guest on the channel today. My good friend Ryan Charkow is here on the channel. In addition to us being friends for over 20 years, which we just realized is really, really crazy, Ryan is also a musician and probably the biggest Beatles fan that I know. It only made sense for him to come on the channel to talk about the Let It Be movie. So welcome to the channel, Ryan. How you doing?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, doing well. Just finished watching the end of the movie actually just about an hour ago. I watched half of it yesterday and then finished a bit this morning. And then I just watched the last few songs on the rooftop. So yeah, I'm ready to get into this and dive into to this film that we finally are able to see after so many years of it not being in official circulation.
Yeah, it's for bootleggers only. If you're a bootlegger, you were able to
Hmm.
watch Let It Be before it came out on Disney Plus. So, like I said, you're the biggest Beatles fan I know. So I'm sure there might be some bigger Beatles fans, but you're a Beatles fanatic going way back to when you were a kid. And we usually just talk about the Beatles when we're hanging out, anyways. So
Hmm.
I figured why not we just make it into a YouTube video and put it up
Absolutely.
on the internet. So you have seen Let It Be before, right? You've seen it before it was on Disney Plus. Do you have a bootleg copy? I don't think Apple Records is listening. They won't send it to you.
I don't know if I do. I may have a shitty or I may have a DVD somewhere, but I'm not sure. I did used to rent an official when they put it out on home video in I guess the early or mid 80s, and the video store near my house did have a copy. So I did rent it a couple times back then. That was probably when I was 9 or 10, maybe even earlier. So I don't think at that time I really appreciated it. I probably thought it was boring. Out of all of the movies, like when I was growing up, that I watched, it was probably my least favorite because there wasn't a lot going on. Obviously, as I got older, it's definitely uh, the most interesting of their movies, I think. Like the other ones are definitely maybe more entertaining, as far as but it's a fictional narrative that you're watching. But this one is probably the most rewarding to watch, and it's just you get to watch them work. And I mean, I know we did see a lot of this footage in Get Back, but I think to see it in its original intended form is always the better way to view it. I think Get Back was great, but am I going to go back and am I going to go back to watch Get Back as much? I dip in and out of it, but I rarely like go and just sit there and watch for hours and hours. So I think this is much more self-contained, and I think it's got a better narrative, and I like that it doesn't lead you by the hand. Like and Get Back, they've got all this stuff that like comes on screen explaining you this happened, why this happened, and that's fine. Especially if there's people I'm sure out there discovering this kind of thing for the first time. But I like how this one, if the bits and bobs that were happening around this time and why Billy Preston showed up or why this happened or why that happened, then that's there, that. But if you don't, it still I think stands up as a pretty important document because at the end of the day, nowadays bands film everything they do or film a lot, or you've got everybody's got a camera, everybody's got some kind of recording device going on, so you get a lot of this. But back then you didn't, and it was like very different to see this, and it's rare. Like there's not a lot of footage of them recording. In the early years especially, there's
Right.
very very little. There's photos, and we have some of the audio evidence, but even that was a lot of it was lost or taped over. Once they decided on which takes they were going to include on the album, a lot of stuff was taped over because tape was expensive. So I think having this document is important, because it shows them working, and it shows like a very interesting part in their career trajectory. Like they're definitely towards the end, and I think it's interesting to see that. I still don't understand why it didn't come out for so long.
Right.
Like just watching it again, I get it. There's tense moments, and Paul doesn't come off that well, but they've been working on this off and on like over the years. They did restore some of the scenes to use in the anthology. That I think when the Let It Be Naked record came out in 2003, there was a plan to put out like a DVD set, with the original movie, and then also with some probably like a Get Back style um, extra features or something like that. That didn't
Mhm.
happen, and then it just kept not happening. And I guess now, I don't know specifically why it came out now, but I think it's good because I think when Get Back came out, I think people were kind of um, down on Michael Lindsay Hogg, and I seem to be remembering reading some things and some people's comments online where they didn't think, that he definitely very present in Get Back. He's not present really at all here, and I think a lot of people like just found him annoying. But
Right.
that footage wasn't really meant to be shown. Like he set up cameras in the studio or in the film studio, and then later in their Apple studio. It wasn't meant to capture, like it was meant to capture whatever was going on, but you're not going to release all that B-roll later on. So I think maybe people um, had a bad sense of what he was doing, and I liked that they tagged on the interview at the beginning of this. I
Exactly.
didn't realize that was coming, so it was nice to see him, talk about the film because I think if it would have made maybe more sense to put this out first and then do Get Back, but I see why maybe they would have wanted to do this. I Get Back is probably more of a grander project, but um, and I guess it leads to this, so maybe the timeline works. But would have been cool if they'd done it the other way around too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, like you're saying with this Let It Be movie, the narrative isn't spelt out for us, right? Because we're familiar with the story behind the making of the record because we've seen Get Back now because it's so like much more detailed, and then obviously the Beatles anthology as well. So I was actually
Mhm.
struck by that as well when when I was watching Let It Be, is that yeah, they go from Twickenham to the Apple studio to the roof, and then Billy Preston just shows up, and there's not really any context as to what's going on. It's just happening. We know the story because we've seen all this the behind the scenes footage, and we've seen everything. We know the story of why this happened, but it's not really spelled out for us in the movie. So I actually felt that was pretty refreshing to have that happen, where you just don't feel like you need to know every detail about what's happening, and it isn't as dark and dour as people say it is. I didn't find that at all. I felt it'd be just as enjoyable as Get Back and just as joyous.
Yeah, I think there's definitely tension. You can feel it, especially the scene with Paul and George kind of bickering a little bit. But I mean, they included that in the anthology, so it's not like they were trying to
Right.
hide that. Beyond that scene, and then there's the one scene where Paul's just kind of going on about recording and then coming back to touring, and John's just kind of not like he's just like looks like he's not interested. So I think that's another scene where, but again though, John was really not in his best state. I think in this point of his life, I think he
Right.
believe was still using heroin at the time. If not, had just come off it. So he was kind of not really all there. And you can see like I think from the songs that he brought to this project, like yeah, you had "Don't Let Me Down," which is very good, and that's strong. But then you had things like "Dig a Pony," which is good, but it's not fantastic. And then
Right.
"Across the Universe" wasn't even yeah, it was in the movie, I guess briefly, and then "Dig It." So like he's not coming with
Take it.
his A material. And then you get George's his contributions are more minimized, I think, in Let It Be than they are in Get Back. Like in Get Back you see them workshopping something, you see them working on All Things Must Pass, you see them working on other things that he was writing at the time. And I mean, and I guess they do have "I Me Mine" here, which is a really good scene, I think, in the film. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's not as it's not as negative as people think. It's I guess it's negative in contrast to what people would have seen of the Beatles up to that point, because in public back in the 60s, you're just seeing what they want, how they want to present themselves. We're not in the age now where like everything is captured. There's no TMZ, obviously. Like I think they
Right.
had an image, and I think this probably went against that image a little bit back then, but it's not like they were at each other's throats. And I mean, they leave out the whole thing where George leaves. Like he leaves, like when we see him Get Back, he leaves pretty much not long after that back and forth where they're going through two of us, and he leaves, and then that's when they switch locations. And but they don't tell you that at all. If you didn't know that, and you didn't have that knowledge going into this movie, which nobody would have back then, I don't think, um, you wouldn't know that he left, right? So they leave that out, which that's and you can see, we know they caught a lot of that on film. They caught him leaving, and they could have included that too. I think the Beatles would have had a say where no, we don't want that in there. But yeah, it could have been a lot more negative, I think, than it was.
And I think a lot of it had to do with the perception of what Paul is doing in this movie, because then there's that scene with Maxwell's Silver Hammer. I know that was a big sticking point for the band at the time because they didn't like working on that song. John and George
Yeah,
hated that song, and Paul
yeah,
really worked the band through the paces of having to do that song over and over again. I found it actually very funny that they were just at the end of the day, after all the great records they made, they're just a band in the studio hashing it out, and Paul's just calling out the chords to them.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's really, it's not, they were coming off the White Album, and this is before Abbey Road. And this feels almost just like they're really directionless in a way when they were recording it a little bit.
Yeah, I think, yeah, obviously in Get Back they include a lot more of them workshopping stuff. Um, they have him allegedly coming up with Get Back on the spot. I don't believe that is what happened. I'm sure he was working on that at home. But yeah, I think it's refreshing to see that, like, we played in bands for a long time, and we've gone through similar, you go through similar things where you're just sitting around trying to bash out songs and figuring out parts, and you got somebody leading that maybe you don't want them to, or you don't want to listen. And it's, when again, like at that time you wouldn't have seen the Beatles go through this, but now you can see it. And I think that you definitely directionless is a good way of putting it, because you can see the songs that they did work on that didn't end up on this particular record, and they wouldn't have fit. And honestly, like, I think the main take, or one of the takeaways I got from watching this, is like it's almost like it's a relationship that has ended. Like, if you with a girlfriend or something, and you know it comes to a logical conclusion sometimes, but then there's always something that works, whether it's like intimacy, whether it's, I don't know, you still have a good, like, you're communicating well, something, there's something that works, and with them it's performing together. But the rest of it is just not, it's not on, and you can see it. Even though I don't think they focused on it as much as you can see and Get Back, like, this is Paul trying to be like, come on guys, like, let's,
Yeah.
come on, like, we can do it, like,
We
we're
could
the
do this,
Beatles. and
lads. Yeah.
and I don't blame him. Like, they're, like he said, in interview, like on the anthologies, like, they're a big act, right? And I
They're a
think,
big act.
yeah, and I think his point was like, well, why aren't we, maximizing that? Like, why let things, get in the way? But I think people, yeah, and like, obviously, like other bands, this didn't really happen where there was like a very definitive, like, we're done, and then never came back. Obviously, things happen where that made that impossible. But I don't even know if if John had lived. I don't know if they probably would have, but who knows? I don't know. I genuinely don't think, up until the end of his life, I'm not sure that he was really comfortable performing live. I think he didn't like it. You can see in the performances he did in the '70s live that they're none of them are great. Um, like, there's nothing out there where it's like, yeah, you must watch this John Lennon live performance. When he worked on, and then it's another film that they did, when he was doing the Imagine record, and they had the cameras there, like, that's good. And I think that's
Yeah.
where he's happy. Um, I think he would have gone out on tour. I think he was starting to get into that again at the after Double Fantasy came out, and they were workshopping a band to go out on the road with. So I think that would have happened. But that's like 10, well, 14 years after the Beatles played their last live show, that he was finally ready. And, George did eventually go out on tour in the '70s, but it was also terrible. Like, he was not,
The Dark
like, it was
Horse
like,
tour.
yeah. And like, if you listen, like, his voice was shot. He was like, as most people back then, he was like, indulging in the substances of the day. And there's some performances I've seen on that tour where he sounds like he can't even sing, right? So I don't think it's something either of them were comfortable with. I think Paul, obviously, that was his comfort place. I think he liked performing live, and that's why he did it so much in the intervening years, and still does, I guess, to this day. Um, but I think the others, Ringo, I'm he would have done, I think, whatever. But John and George, I think, had a very strong aversion to it, and I get it. But also, you got to remember, we're seeing the Beatles together in public from like late 1962 to, around this time. That's 7 years, but they go back, longer than that
Right.
into the, 1957. Um, and that's a long time, especially when you've been friends and close to somebody since you were teenagers. Like that dynamic is like, it's hard to shed that dynamic. And I think that's why Paul and George have that, um, why that happens between them, where like Paul's like, well, I feel like, I'm talking to you but I'm just annoying you, and I, I don't know why. And I think that dynamic of like big brother little brother, where Paul maybe
Mhm.
is kind of stuck, or in that, in seeing him in that way, because they've known each other since they were kids. It's hard to shed that a little bit. And I think even later on in their lives, it was, you see it, even in the anthology when they're together. It's not like, I think they loved each other, but there was definitely some tension there. I mean, he didn't even show up to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction,
Right.
right? And so, yeah. Anyway, kind of getting a little on a tangent here, but I think the big takeaways for me on of this film overall are like, you do get moments of that camaraderie that come
Mhm.
back. When George and Ringo are working on Octopus's Garden, I think that's a really touching scene that they
That's a
included.
great
I'm
scene.
glad that they included that in the actual film, and it wasn't just in the Get Back, uh, um, package or whatever. I think that's a really fantastic scene, because it shows them, like, John and Paul work together, and that's, whether we see it a lot or whatever, but that's a well documented partnership and friendship and working relationship. But George and Ringo, it's like it is just as strong. They'd obviously, like, especially, and like, they did write a lot later
Mhm.
on after the Beatles ended. They had Photograph they did together. He
Yep.
produced, or George produced a lot of Ringo's stuff. Up until they had a falling out when George like slept with his wife, which is probably not a good thing to do. But yeah, I mean, they had a very strong bond, and I'm glad that that was in there. So you see these flashes, obviously, when we can maybe talk about it separately, but you see the flashes of their brilliance when they're doing the rooftop gig. But at the same time, you also see them as human beings. Like, it's not perfect. Even those performances are not. Um, like John, they leave in the cut of "Don't Let Me Down" where he forgets the words, and which he
Right.
always did anyway. They leave in the last run through of "Get Back" where his guitar is either out of tune, or his hands are so cold that he's not playing the right scale for the solos. I can't tell. But they left that in, right? Whereas, like, I don't think you'd see bands do that today, or even not even just today, but even like 20, 25 years ago, where you're like, yeah, we're too perfect now, and people don't want to show the warts and all thing. And I'm not saying
Mhm.
we got that here. There's definitely, they definitely left a lot on the cutting room
Mhm.
floor, but you're getting them. And I think we've seen a lot of these kind of films in the intervening years, like, I don't know, you name it. Any music documentary is going to have the band working in the studio, but
Yeah.
at this point, you really only had. I know the Stones did a short film of them working on "Sympathy for the Devil." It was Jean-Luc Godard directed it. Beyond that, there wasn't much, because nobody at that time, I don't think there was much of an interest. I think as like the '70s progressed, then there was more of an interest in like, how is this made, and like what goes into the sausage and all that.
Mhm.
But I think, back in the '60s, nobody thought about doing this. Also because they were not, up until Sergeant Pepper, they weren't taking a lot of time with records. Even Revolver, which they did take, time. They didn't take a lot. They were still touring around that time. So
Yeah.
you weren't even getting the opportunity to film them in this kind of situation. So yeah.
Yeah. It would have been cool to have this type of footage for something like Revolver or Sergeant Pepper or even the White Album. That would have been really cool. The thing I find funny about this whole Let It Be project when they kind of set out to do it was that they were gonna record the album in the studio and then they were gonna go out
Hmm.
and play this big concert. That was how
Yeah.
the movie was gonna end. And I find it so funny that they had this ambitious, or at least the director did, and Paul, I guess too, this ambitious idea to go out to, was it Egypt or somewhere in the middle of the
Hmm.
desert and do this big show. I can't
Yeah.
picture them doing that with this material and the way that the project was going leading up to that point. It just doesn't
No.
make any sense. And you can tell that Paul really wanted to do something special. The rooftop ended up being special, but you could tell that Paul was really trying to make something happen. And
Yeah.
the other guys just weren't interested. And there was no way that they were going to go do this elaborate concert somewhere in the world. Like there's no way that was going to happen based on what was already happening in the studio for them.
No, and I mean George was against that. That was one of the conditions for him coming back, was that they would abandon the idea of doing this grand concert somewhere. Initially the project was meant to be a TV movie, and that's why they filmed it in 16 millimeter with 16 millimeter film, and
Right.
that's why like when they did the restoration, like they restored the audio and they restored the video, but because they recorded it with 60 millimeter film with the idea that it was going to be a TV show. That's why they started recording in the film studio, because it's like, we'll do a few days here and then we'll find a venue for the show. I think they kicked around some venues in London, like the Roundhouse, maybe the Albert Hall, which would have been that I could see. Maybe not necessarily with this material as much, but yeah, something like the pyramids of Giza or whatever. I don't know, Pompeii, which I guess Pink Floyd later did. But I don't see, like, it makes sense for a band like Pink Floyd to go in a Roman amphitheater and record something like Echoes or whatever from Metal. But it doesn't make sense for the Beatles to go and play at the pyramids and
Yeah,
play
you can play
one after
Dig It.
909.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's not
Maggie
strong.
May.
Like it's good stuff, but you see it at the on the rooftop. Like at the end, they're like, okay, what? No, like they didn't have a lot of songs to do, right? Like they could have obviously leaned on some of their older stuff, which I think that would have been interesting. But on the roof, obviously, also it's January, it's London, it's not warm. They're definitely freezing up there. I don't know how Paul is just existing out there in a sport coat and a shirt, where the other, John and George in their big fur coats and Ringo in his wife's rain jacket. But I think it's interesting, like that they actually thought that was going to happen. I think it was just Paul and the film director that like thought they could get it to that point. I mean, you can see there's no way. Like John's not in a condition to do that. George is checked out, and I mean he said since that like the recording the White Album, I think, took a toll on him, coming from really enjoying himself in India, then coming to record. I think initially, like when you can hear them on the Esher demos, like I think that's a positive atmosphere. But as that recording went on, it just got, tedious, and nobody was, it just wasn't good. And then, he spent time in Woodstock with the band and Dylan and all that. And I think he saw how they were working, which was different than most bands at the time were working. And I think, and the Beatles included. And I think, he says it in the anthology. He's coming from this wonderful experience in Woodstock with the band and Dylan, and then coming to this winter of discontent with the Beatles. And it's a little dramatic, but I don't know. I don't blame him. Like
Yeah.
I can put myself in his shoes. I can see why he feels the way he does. I think some people maybe think, okay, is he overreacting? But I think I feel, I can't imagine having to live in that kind of shadow. And like obviously they've been incredibly successful as a band, but just at this point where he's clearly writing a lot. Like it's one thing a few years earlier where he the songs he wrote were likely the songs that were going to go on the albums, but at this point he's backlogged like quite a lot of songs, whether it was in India or afterwards. That there's a lot there, and like it says a lot that they decided not to progress with something like All Things Must Pass, or or a few others that he brought to the table, but especially something like that. And he would have had others. I mean, even at this point, I think Isn't It a Pity had been kicking around for 2 or 3 years at this point. So he had a lot, and I think he would have brought more to the table if they were more receptive to his stuff, like when they were doing the work at the film studio, but they weren't. And I think John is like that with Paul's stuff too. I mean, I was just reading a bit about the recording of some of these songs back, and when you watch Long and Winding Road, and I know the knock on that Phil Spector version that later appeared on the record was like, it's overdone. Well, it is, but the recording that they had was awful. Like it's not good. Like it's a demo at best, right? Like
Mhm.
John's bass is terrible. Like
Yeah.
it's not good. You've got that organ solo that seems to me like more of like insert solo here. We'll fix this up later kind of thing. Um, and I think they did what they could to fix it up. And by that point, Paul was like, I don't care, like just do what you want kind of thing. So they did. Um, and yeah, I think that I could see why, the tensions would have escalated like they did, but yeah, I don't know. Like I can, yeah, it's an interesting way to look at it, and like I think
Mhm.
it's good that we were able to see it.
Well, it's like we've gotten this embarrassment of riches over the last little while, with Get Back, with Let
Hmm.
It Be, and we were saying earlier on in the conversation how Let It Be is the much more cohesive version, obviously because it's distilled down to that hour and a half, as opposed to being, how long was Get Back? That was like a good 6 4 6 hours.
6 hours, yeah,
That was
two.
six
It was
hours.
3 2-hour pieces. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
And
that's a lot.
I never really understood with Let It Be, because especially in Get Back, you see that the band was working on so many songs at the time, because you have songs from Let It Be, you have them working on
Hmm.
songs from Abbey Road, and then you have all three
Yeah,
of them working on songs that would later on be on their solo records. And it
yeah,
never really made sense to me why they picked the songs they did for Let It Be, because obviously you have Let It Be, Long and Winding Road, these big classic songs, but then there's a lot of filler on there as well. Why would they do that when they had all this other great material already in the hopper? It just didn't really make much sense to me, like kind of the timeline of when they
yeah.
decided to use these songs.
I think it was just almost honestly like a first come first serve. I think they probably had their list of songs, and I think these were just towards the top of the list of each guy bringing whatever to the table. And I think
Yeah.
you can, when they work on the stuff that later ends up on Abbey Road, it is less finished. So I think they had an end date, right? They had to end it by the end of January. This film, this project, because Ringo was going to film a movie. So they I think they just had to say, well, these are the ones that we know, that we've fleshed out enough that they're like complete songs, and the other ones are just fragments. Like "Oh
Mhm.
Darling" was a fragment at this point.
Yeah.
"Octopus's Garden" was barely a fragment.
Maxwell
Something,
Silverhammer. Yeah.
yeah,
Silverhammer.
"Maxwell Silverhammer," which they hated, which it is not good. Um,
And when
you
Mel
know
Evans playing the anvil
the anvil, yeah.
in the studio. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I agree. There were better. I mean, you could probably say there's filler on both records. I've, recently, like Abbey Road, like I go back and forth on it. Like, yes, it's great, but it's also meh, not meh, but like I sometimes I'm just not. There's a lot of hype around it, and people like, oh, like there's like they came back together, they did this, like wow, and yeah, but they did and they didn't. Like there was still, like again, that's, I'm sure if we had, and maybe they did, but I'm sure if they were filming the recording of Abbey Road, it was also very disjointed. They were rarely all in there at the same
Right.
time. A lot of it is okay. John comes in and does this, he lays this down, and then with they do overdubs, and then by the time Abbey Road comes out and they have to go and fix up some Let It Be stuff, like John's gone by that point. Like when they
Right.
do, I mean, when they finally get I Me Mine to a point that they can put it on the record,
Mhm.
it's just George, Paul, and Ringo that are on that.
Mhm.
John's not even anywhere near it, and even the one that eventually appeared on the album, like it's just like they recorded it and then they just repeated it. Like it's not even, they didn't record the full song. Like they did like the verse, they did the chorus, they did the verse, and I think and then they just repeated it again. Like so, just to
Yeah.
make it so it's like 2.5 minutes or however long it is. Like, so it wasn't even that, I think Abbey Road, and I in the anthology, they kind of like dress it up as like, oh, we're going to come back and do one. It's like, oh, John too. Yep. John too. And it's like, no, it
Not
wasn't. And
really.
that's
Yeah.
fine. I honestly feel this is a better final, ending point on their career. Even though Abbey Road is like, yes, it's got the end on it. I still think that this is with Let It Be, like the song. I think that's a very fitting ending, even though it's not the end of the album, and the Long and Winding Road too.
Right.
So I think this works better as a final statement. And I would have been okay if like that was it. but I mean, then have them work on those songs as solo records. But I'm not going to complain about having Abbey Road, but I think
Yeah.
Let It Be sometimes might work as a better final thing. And I mean, when they put it out, it was like that's what it was. Like by the time it went out, like they were done. Like it was, I think it came out in May 1970. Like everything was wrapped up. And I mean, even like I've got the version, like the copy they put out in this
Yeah,
box.
show us what you
You
got.
got
Yeah.
this, the box, and like people even called it back then like a tombstone because it's this massive box that cost like quite a bit of money. Like I think it was retailing for like £5 in the UK, which is not, which was expensive back then.
Mhm.
Um, so it was like, yeah, it was kind of like very much like this is the end of it, and like they put a lot to it, but I don't think it was the Beatles that really had a lot of input. Like you had the record. It came with this poster that has all of the sorry about that, but it has this poster of like the different Apple releases that had come out by
Right.
that point. And then you had the book, which it's really not in good, like in good shape, but it's like
So
delicate, but
this is
like it's
an
just stuff from
original
the
edition.
movies.
This is
Yeah,
the
sorry.
original
Yeah, this
edition.
is the yeah, this one is like a UK original copy that I bought a number of years ago. And like the poster, yeah, you don't usually see the poster included, but but I was lucky to find one with it. And
Mhm.
then but I think by this point it was like whatever. Like I don't think they were the one. And actually, the book says let's see if I can- the book says "Get Back" on the spine. So like that was initially what the record was going to be called,
Right.
and then I think they were like, I don't know if this is true, but the way I always thought about it was like, well, if you put out a record called "Get Back" and you're like definitely not getting back, then it may send the wrong message to your fans. And like
Yeah.
I didn't include the record here, um, but it's very much a like it's not Get Back. It's very Let It. I'm just gonna put this down. It's very Let It Be because they're the photos are like it's just four individual photos. It's like it's very much like you can see them kind of drifting apart. Um, and then like yeah, this is the record that came in it.
Mhm.
And I think I can't remember. I think this one has like they put it out on a red. Yeah, it's got the red. Nope, doesn't. It's got in the US they put it out on a red apple label, but you can see they've got a red apple on the back, but
Yeah.
the label doesn't have that. But yeah, it's to me, I've come around to it a lot. I agree with you. There is filler. Obviously, the throwaway songs on there aren't fantastic.
Not putting Don't Let Me Down on there doesn't make any sense.
No, that doesn't make sense. And they did correct that when they did Let It Be Naked. And like I remember when that came out and I was like, "Oh yeah, this is good." And then I've listened to it again. I'm like, I think I prefer I think that was a mistake. And I get
Yeah.
why Paul wanted to do that because he thought that Phil Spector, messed up um a lot of those songs and your opinion might vary on his work. I don't think he messed them up. Like yeah, they're very grand and I think especially the Long and Winding Road, like he definitely overdid it,
Mhm.
but he wasn't given a great track to work with. Like the vocal is great, and maybe the piano is usable, but like a lot of the stuff he had to kind of overdub these strings to like kind of get rid of a lot of the mistakes that were on that. So I think now I'm not going to shed a tear for Phil Spector getting getting a bunch of negativity for this because obviously he wasn't the best person in the world.
Yeah.
But
Come on,
I
Phil
think he
Spector's not a
took
bad guy.
yeah, I just misunderstood. I think he took a little bit of on the chin for it when the Beatles, none of them really wanted anything to do with it anyway. So it was just like, here, John's like, just do it and we'll put it out and that's it. So it's not like Paul was going over and above with these tracks and being like, no, I want to work on them, I want to make this right. He had moved on. He was recording his solo record. He was on the farm. He was finished. They all were at some point. So and they were going through all those issues with all those business issues. And then they had, Alan Klein and Lee Eastman and all that garbage. And,
Yeah.
so, and they cover that a lot in Get Back. And I'm glad also that they never really touched on that in this movie because it wouldn't make sense to do that. But I do think that, Yeah, I agree. Putting Don't Let Me Down would have tied the record together more. Get rid of Maggie May, get rid of Dig It, and put that on. That makes a lot of sense. And I think you try and like I think they were really stupid to not really get a good try on All Things Must Pass. Maybe would it have fit? It's hard to
Mhm.
say because we know how it fits with what we got. But I think that was really dumb of the other two of John and Paul to kind of be a little dismissive. And I mean, there's a decently worked out version that gets included on the anthology. Like they were pretty much there
Yeah.
with it. Obviously, it was better once George did it on his own. But yeah, I think Paul, yeah, wanted to maybe rehab his vision of the record a little bit, and it's yeah, it was. I remember when it came out, like it looks kind of stupid like what do they got on like they put Don't Let Me Down. I think they yeah across like that was pretty much and they took off those small songs. Um and then they put that Fly on the Wall disc out. But
Yeah.
I think it's very I don't even know if it's on streaming. Like I feel like it's been kind of quietly deleted. I'm not sure if it's even on like Spotify or anything like that.
Yeah, I'd have to check
Um
that.
it's an interesting prod like this whole thing. It's like I think now it's finally this is the Let It Be is finished. I think
Mhm.
you
It's
had
taken long
this
enough.
yeah, I think without having like a restoration release of this, it kind of left things unfinished. Even yeah, you had one official home video release and that was it. And I think this is good to kind of put a um I guess put a bow on it and
Mhm.
move on to some I don't know move on to whatever else you're going to do. I guess they're continuing a relationship with Disney, so maybe it's something where that ends up
Mhm.
being a streaming home for the anthology. I was
Mhm.
kind of looking for that to come out last year instead of the Red and Blue albums, like with Now and Then. I think it would have made a lot more sense. I guess it's
It
a
would
little
have,
bit.
yeah.
It's obviously it's a lot more work to maybe put something to do some rehabilitation or restoration work on the anthology.
Mhm.
But the fact that you can't even watch it it's even hard to watch illegally. Like even on YouTube, it's
Mhm. Yeah, you
it's
can't
there,
play
but
it.
it's not in like not in a complete format. So like I have the DVDs and I
Sure.
have the videos somewhere, but that's it. So I do think that's well overdue because I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of new fans that have come to the band in the last since that happened, right? Because that was 95 when that came out, and I think that's kind of what started the our generation into it, even though I was definitely I predated that by a few years, but I think that's when maybe people our age, um, and maybe even Gen Xers kind of brought them into it and made the Beatles. I don't want to say cool, but eventually they got cool again. Because
Mhm.
when after John died, I think in the '80s and even in the '70s, like the Beatles, it wasn't cool to like
Mhm.
the Beatles. Like it was kind of nothing. And like I think in the '80s you had a few nostalgic kicks at the can with the
Mhm.
20-year anniversaries of whatever.
Yeah.
But it wasn't really until the anthology came out that people started really taking them seriously again and really looking back at their career. And I
Mhm.
think and then I think when Paul went back out on tour in 2002, I think that's really when people started taking notice and went back
Yeah.
on tour playing all the old songs in a more robust way than he ever did before. Like that was pretty much his set. Like
Mhm.
would not really do as much new stuff. So I think that's when you started getting more generations kind of into it. And I think it would be good if these are newer fans that for them to see something like the anthology. I think we're
Mhm.
lucky that they did it because if they had not, obviously George passed. Doing it now, I think wouldn't be very good because you got them at that point. They're in their 50s, early 50s,
Mhm.
um, they're still remembering better, and I think they're better spoken. Like Paul still tells these stories well, but he's slowed down. And
Mhm.
obviously, I think having him and Ringo and George on that together,
Yeah.
we're lucky that they were able to do that because
Mhm.
it wasn't always something, they did it because George needed money. He found himself on
Mhm.
the wrong end of that lawsuit, My Sweet Lord lawsuit, and I
Yeah.
think another one. So he needed the cash, and that's why they did it. So I hope that gets a streaming release soon, just because I think you can restore a lot of the video in there, and then the audio. Obviously, they've already done that, so hopefully, and maybe there's some archival interview footage that they can splice in. I don't know if anything or very much was left on the cutting room floor for the anthology, but they seem to be able to find all kinds of stuff, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're able to find something.
Mhm. Yeah, that'd be really cool to see the anthology on streaming. Like I have my DVD still, which is a treasure in my DVD collection and my music
Yeah.
collection. But to have it on streaming would be awesome because it is really the most comprehensive history of the Beatles. I know
Hmm.
it's a little bit cleaned up, you know, for just general consumption. When you read some of the books about the Beatles, there's a lot more in there that doesn't quite make it into the anthology, but it is a really nice streamlined history of the band. Another thing too I've noticed is they've been doing these reissues over the last decade or so. They did
Hmm.
Revolver, they did Abbey Road, White Album, all these different things. But the early albums in particular have been getting kind of the shaft from getting re-released and remastered by Giles Martin. Do you think that they're going to do those, like something like Please Please Me through to Help and Rubber Soul? Do you think that's going to happen eventually?
Yeah, I think they will, because obviously there's money to be made. I don't know how many outtakes and stuff. Like, I don't know how robust they can make, especially the early packages. Like,
Mhm.
there's definitely outtakes, things we haven't heard. Um, like, I don't know. I tend not to dip in too much in the Beatles online community. I don't like, I don't
You're
really
not
get
on the
along.
boards, on the message boards anymore.
I don't really get along with a lot of other Beatles fans. They kind of annoy me. Um, but
Except for
but
me, okay.
yeah, well, no, yeah, but people that think they're bigger fans than I am, which they probably are, but I don't even know how you judge that.
Yeah.
But anyway, but yeah, like, I think there's talk out there is like, will the next one, like, they usually put something out around Christmas time, right? Because everybody
Yeah.
wants to buy, their Beatles fan and their family, whatever the news thing for Christmas. So I think this year, there, before the Now and Then stuff started bubbling up, I think there was talk of like, oh, will it be Rubber Soul? To me, it makes the most sense to go back now. Like, you've done Let It Be, you've done Revolver, which is kind of like a little out of place, but whatever. You did that. You could go backwards and do Rubber Soul and then back to Please Please Me. I think it makes maybe a little more sense to do it the other way around and go back to Please Please Me. You could do Please Please Me and With the Beatles together. I don't know, like,
Mhm.
something like that. But I think you're right. It does need some attention, because when you listen to the remix versions that they did for the Red album, that did cause a little bit of controversy. But I think it's interesting to hear a fresh take on these songs. I don't think any of these new mixes replace the original, like, mono copies of the records that I have or that people have. I think that's how it was intended. I think, like,
Mhm.
music is one of those things, and I guess film as well, where you go back and, like, oh, let's tinker with this and do that and the other.
Mhm.
But, like, I don't know, you don't do that with like classic paintings or sculpture or artwork and stuff like that. Even with films, like, I don't think you're definitely, yeah, I think people I think are also coming to say about that, like, screwing up aspect ratios. Like, now when you watch The Simpsons on Disney, like, they've put it into like a 16:9 aspect
Mhm.
ratio, but a lot of it, like, gets cut off.
Well,
Same thing
they
with
put the original
Seinfeld and
back
stuff.
on too, yeah.
Oh, they did?
So
Okay. Well,
yeah,
I know
yeah.
with Seinfeld, they put the widescreen version, and, like, a lot of it gets cut off. So I
Yeah.
think they're hopefully, yeah, I don't know where that came from, but I do think that they're overdue for a look at the earlier records, because I think, yeah, with the re-releases, recently, and I think in general, people are more focused on, like, okay, once they got to Revolver and then Sergeant Pepper, like, okay, then they were like a serious band, which, yes, I guess you could say that, but they were still doing amazing work. And what I think lends itself well for their stuff to be remixed and remastered, whatever work they're doing, is that they were recording using, like, some of the best equipment at the time. Obviously, compared to what I won't say compared to what we use now, but compared to some of the things that are used now, it's obviously, very um, rudimentary. But I mean, a lot of people are going back to that. It's expensive to record on tape, but it sounds the best. Anyway, so I think because Abbey Road was such um, a relatively advanced studio for its time, and EMI was such a like they because they specialized in like classical recordings and all kinds of different things that needed very precise sound engineers, and like these guys were like almost like scientists in a laboratory. Like they literally did wear lab coats up until the mid 60s, running around the studio. So I think they were lucky that they were able to record with that kind of equipment, and that is now allowing someone like Giles Martin, and I guess using a little bit of this machine learning technology that Peter Jackson's team has perfected, that allows them to go back and I think tinker a bit more than maybe other bands that recorded at the same time, but in different studios. And obviously the Beatles at that time were the biggest band in the world, so they were, even though they, when you think of recording an album now, like even with something like Revolver, they recorded it in like very like in like not a very long period of time, but for that they were given the most amount of time out of all the other bands. So I think they were at least afforded that luxury, even though now it looks like even Sergeant Pepper, they took a decent amount of time. But when you look at bands now or in the last 20-25 years, the amount of time that they spend on recording albums, it's like considerably more than even the Beatles would have taken on
Yeah.
Sergeant Pepper, right? Like that was a few months, which was unheard of at the time for a rock band or for a pop band. But now it's totally different. And again, that's
Totally
something that,
is.
yeah, I think now it's like you take for granted that um, how compact their career was. Like we don't think about that a lot, and or maybe people, it's not
Yeah.
top of mind. Like they did all of this in less than 8 years, really,
I
which
know. It's
is
insane when you think
out of
about it.
control. It's
Yeah.
I don't like and obviously they had to, like it just you just time I think moved differently back then. But yeah, if you look at what happened, like music they recorded, tours they went on, stuff that happened in their lives, like a month in the Beatles' life could be like 2 or 3 years in a
Yeah.
normal in like normal band's life nowadays, or
Yeah.
even like 20 years after them.
Yeah. When
So
you think about like, in your own life, 8 years, there's not,
it's nothing.
I think about the last 8 years. I'm like, okay, there's been changes, but things are generally, pretty
Yeah.
much the same. But for the Beatles, things just like rapidly just progressed. But like you were saying earlier, though, there's that prehistory before the
Mhm.
62, uh, the years when they were growing up and through the years they were in Hamburg into the
Yeah.
Cavern Club into when they finally hit the scene. It's like, there was this prehistory to it as well, and that's kind of what started to propel them through the 60s.
Yeah, and they did a lot of that work before anybody really knew who they were, right? Like
Mhm.
working in Hamburg like that was a godsend for them because they're working thousands of hours over, over a year, or however long they go for a few months, come back. The amount of performing they did, like 8-12 hours a night. Maybe they exaggerate it, but like they would play all the time. So a
Yeah.
lot of the mistakes, we didn't hear them because they workshopped them out. Whereas like the Rolling Stones or the Kinks or other of their contemporaries around the same time coalesced a lot faster and needed to get product out before going through like 10,000 hours of what they
Mhm.
say is the where you get perfection or whatever, or when you master something. And I think they were able to do that, but the Stones, like, they didn't have that like, and you can hear it, you can hear them evolve on their
Mhm.
records differently than you hear the Beatles, because the Beatles came to their first record like a ready-made unit, basically, even though
Right.
Ringo was only in it, not for very long. But they were so dialed into each other that they came and just boom right out the gate. Whereas like other bands, they would always have hits and stuff like that. But when you look at some of their other like album tracks or B-sides,
Mhm.
they're not as good as what the Beatles are putting out there. Like you can look at
Yeah.
some of the Beatles, some of their album tracks could have been a hit single for another band, right? And
Mhm.
and and they did write those for other bands as well, but they had a lot, and they were, I think, so good that it took a while for others to catch up. But they did, like obviously the Beach Boys did, and
Yeah.
and the Stones eventually did, and a lot of these guys did. But I think they had that luxury of being able to be shit, or sorry, being able to not be so
Yeah.
good.
It's YouTube. You can say shit at least once.
Oh, okay. Being able to like go through your growing pains of being in a band, which like they were able to do that out of the spotlight, which some other bands didn't get that opportunity as much, because the Beatles, once they came out, was like, well, where can we get some more bands? Like, where are these other bands? And so yeah, they didn't get that. But yeah, I'm hoping that we get some more interesting releases. But also on the other side, and I think we've talked about this, uh, like at some point, like you gotta put uh, a bow on this. Like they've now put out the last song,
Yeah.
which was nice. You know,
The
that
last
was
song. Well, everybody's still waiting for Carnival of Light. Come on, that's gonna.
that won't, I don't think you'll hear that, nor do you want
Yeah.
to. It's just, I
No,
think it's like
it would be so
it's just
disappointing.
noise.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, people are expecting something very not what it is. It's just going to be them, like, fooling around with electronic instruments. It'll sound like their other electronic mistakes, like two versions, or
Revolution. Yeah.
electronic, Wonderwall and all that stuff. Yeah, yeah, just stuff that fine, and it's an interesting artistic expression, but it's not like, listen, it's not, you wouldn't go down and be like, yes, Revolution number 9 today, that's going to get the repeat.
Yeah.
Maybe there's people that do that, but not me. But
It
I
ruins the
yeah,
flow of a
I'm
White Album. You get through the whole record,
yeah.
and then they just stick it in there, and then they have Good Night, and then you're just done. And it's like that makes no
Yeah, it
sense
does.
whatsoever.
Like, it's surprising that they got it in, that he got it in there. I'm surprised that, but I think by that point they were just putting whatever, I think they just decided. But yeah, so you get to a point where it's like, at what point do we say there's nothing left, right? Like, they did this in the '70s, putting out stupid, you know, thematic compilations, like the Beatles ballads, the Beatles love
Yeah.
songs, the Beatles real music from the films, and like, now that Let It Be, okay, that now has been restored, and we've got that. Like, what? There's no other real white whale out there. So like everything that comes out is going to be like seen as a bit of a cash grab. And I think like the Revolver box was okay. There's a lot they could have included that
Yeah.
they didn't. Like, there's a lot of takes that they could have included that they didn't. The Let It Be box that they put out a few years ago was not very good. That got definitely didn't get a lot of good reviews within the Beatles, fan community. Like, yeah, you got Rubber Soul, you got Hell. I don't know. Like, the
Well, we got
movies
the
have all
Esher
been
demos on the White
re-released.
demo or the White
Yeah,
Album. We got the Esher
yeah,
demos,
that
so
was
that was
another
nice.
thing that was like
Yeah.
legendary. And the only,
Mhm.
like you said, the only other thing out there really is Carnival of Light, which is not going to be good.
Yeah, it won't be.
So at what point do you say, like, we're done? And maybe it's when they're no longer with us that Apple says no more. But I worry that once that happens, then you're just gonna, the floodgates are open and it's just Beatles, whatever. But
Mhm.
like, I don't know what is the next generation, like, stewardship of their legacy going to look like? Does it pass? Yoko, she's, not, she's over, she's 92 or something like
Mhm.
that. So she's not long for this world.
Yeah.
Paul, they're going to expire.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Maybe they've got some 10, 20 years, I don't know.
Mhm.
They seem to have good genetics, or that they're vegetarians, maybe that's helping Paul. But
Yeah.
eventually, so what's going to happen when there's no more Beatles, like, that were in the band? Like,
Yeah.
you have Olivia, and then I guess you have their children, and I don't know what their viewpoints are. I think Sean is very dialed into this stuff,
Mhm.
mostly, like, John's solo stuff. He's very involved with the re-releases. That, he did put out a song with James McCartney recently that
Yeah, I saw that.
is not bad. It's okay.
The
But yeah,
Lennon
what's going to
McCartney.
happen? It's the Lennon McCartney song. You can't say it's not. Um, yeah, I think he's involved. Obviously, you've got Danny, who's very involved with George's work as well. So maybe they're going to be good stewards of this going forward. But money talks, and like, if we, you know, I don't know, will the songwriting revert back? Like, will the
Yeah.
what do you call it? The publishing rights. I think
Mhm.
there's something happening there. So we'll see. Like, what does the future hold for the Beatles? Like, more than 50 years after they ceased to exist as a functioning band. Like, it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know what would have happened if John had lived. I don't know if they got. I guess at some point everybody gets back together.
Mhm. Especially
Money talks,
nowadays. Yeah.
obviously, and yeah, so they probably would have. But what would it have been like? It could have been like, the anthology songs were decent.
Mhm.
But if it was the four of them getting in a room together, I don't know. Maybe it would have been good. Maybe it would have had like a Page and Plant kind of thing with the
Mhm.
Lennon McCartney, where they would have gone on tour together and like bring the Lennon McCartney songbook to the stage, and I don't know, I don't know. I don't know what the
Would have been
future would have
cool.
looked like. It's interesting to think, but who knows? And I don't know what's going to happen. But at some point, you got to be like, guys, like we put out everything. Like there's no more
Yeah.
formats. Like
There's
now
no
we're
more
all streaming. It's all digital. We're not like
brain
that.
implants. I need my Beatles
I
albums
guess
in my brain,
I guess so. I guess
permanently.
that's the next step, but we'll see. Like I think people initially when they announced the red and blue albums, people were like, "Oh yeah," and then once it came out, people were like, "Wait a second, like why?" Like a compilation in streaming, like in the streaming age, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because you can put together playlists. So that's
Right.
like which is a compilation. So it's like you're
Yeah.
reissuing this
Spotify has the this
compilation.
is playlists, right? So it's like
Yeah,
this is
and
the
I guess
Beatles is
you've got
essentially
some
that.
songs that they remixed and worked on, but yeah, I think people initially were like, okay, that's kind of neat, and then once it was released, they were like, wait, why do we have this? Why did I spend $240 on this thing? Like, so we'll see. I don't know, but it's
Yeah.
nice to see Let It Be. I'm glad that they got their act together on that because it was well overdue, and I like that they because another point, like when they decided to make it into a theatrical release, obviously um, they had to transfer from 16 millimeter to a 35 millimeter projection, and that impacted the quality of the picture. It made it really grainy, and it kind of looked cool because it kind of looked a little bit like grungy. But I saw like a comparison online of like the original, what it looked like versus this one, and they brightened it up a lot. So at least they were able to
Oh,
like
that's good.
restore the colors how it was intended. Because when you're working with 16 millimeter film, it doesn't look, yeah, it's not the best. So I'm glad that they were able to do that. And yeah, we'll see what's next. I have no idea.
Well, hopefully they put the rest of the Beatles films on Disney Plus. I would like to see Hard Day's Night and Help and Magical
Yeah,
Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine
yeah.
on there as well.
I was surprised they haven't done that. Like because those are all they re whatever you call them remastered whatever
Hmm.
it is with film. They did that like numerous times now. It's been on DVD, it's been on
I have the
Blu-ray. So
DVDs.
they
Yeah.
yeah, so they have high, I don't know if it's 4K or whatever the new standard of quality is, but I don't think it would take a lot to get there. And I hope, yeah, if it's not the anthology, I'm hoping that because that's another thing that unless you have those DVDs, which are a little bit easier to find,
Mhm.
but a lot of people don't, have DVD players really anymore. So I think those are good. You know, I hope that the next thing isn't some kind of Yellow Submarine thing because they do sometimes default back to Yellow Submarine because it's like
Right.
people really I don't like it. It's not my like it's something that's like very associated with the Beatles and they have a lot of stuff branded with Yellow Submarine and the cartoons and that the animation, but it's never been my favorite. But I do hope the other movies because another point of this like this ended up being their final film that they to fill their United Artists studio contract,
Right.
and it's a vastly different film than the others. You had one that was a cartoon, and you had the other two that were live action, uh, fictional stories. But they're good movies, and I think people again like would be like, especially A Hard Day's Night is like it's not just a good movie because the Beatles are in it. Like it's a well made film for its time. Like I
Mhm.
and it's well shot. The writing is incredible. They it was written for them like to like
Mhm.
based on somebody kind of based on the screenwriter watching how they interact with each other and help. I love it, but some people, I think it
Yeah.
maybe doesn't age as well as A Hard Day's Night. But they're all important to see, and I mean, Magical Mystery Tour as well. Like I like them all, and I agree. I think that should be something. It doesn't seem like that's very difficult to just okay, we'll clean it up a little bit or restore it into 4K or whatever you need to do, and then it goes up on streaming. It adds
Yeah.
some value to the service, because like if I'm considering which streaming services to subscribe to and not and to cancel, if one of them is the home of the Beatles video library or movie library or whatever, I'm not likely to cancel that, and I'm sure there's other Beatles fans that will see it the same way. So it's a good selling point. I mean, they put
Mhm.
out McCartney, whatever, 3-2-1, 1-2-3, whatever that was with
Yeah,
Rick Rubin.
that was good.
Maybe they'll do it's decent. Yeah, I don't think Rick Rubin he didn't seem to know a lot about anything, but that's fine. That's his character.
So
But anyway,
you
I
were in a
hope.
band. They were called the Beatles. What is that what
Yeah,
they
it's
were
kind of
called?
a little like that. So wait, you played piano on this track? Like, wait a second, is that you on bass, Paul? Like, wait a
What
second, do you play bass? What?
Sergeant
This is
Pepper's?
blowing
What?
my mind. That's you? Wait a second. Hold on a second here. You're Ringo. Like, wasn't he on Shining Time Station? That guy was in this band. Man, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah. It
But
was
yeah,
good. It
so
was good
maybe
though.
there's more projects. It was good. It was good to hear
Yeah,
him talk about stuff. So maybe there's more projects like that. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know.
yeah.
I hope they put something out more though. It would be good to see it.
Yeah, for sure. So with Let It Be out now, it's out there. What would you give the movie like as in terms of like your final thoughts or maybe a score? Usually I rate things on the channel like
Hmm.
out of five. It's been I feel like we'd both be like it's the Beatles default 5 out of 5 across the
Uh,
board. But I don't know if you want to deviate from that at all.
No, honestly, I think even if I wasn't a massive Beatles fan, I think this is a well-made documentary. It's
Mhm.
not the best, like it's nothing like groundbreaking even for the
Mhm.
time. But I think what was groundbreaking is seeing a band like this working, which nobody, like I said, no, it wasn't really something that people were used to seeing back then, and it's something we didn't really talk about. But like you see, um, how they were playing these songs and things that they did. Like you had John and George occasionally playing bass, which you didn't see that when they were playing live. Um, it was
Yeah,
neat to
very
see
cool.
them do two of us and have George. Because for years I used to think um, that was a bass line, but it's actually a guitar line that he's just playing lower down. And
Yeah.
I knew that before I saw it, but it's interesting to see that kind of stuff. You see their instruments lying around. You see some of their classic, instruments that they may not use in this
Mhm.
production, but they're there. So I think it's a 5 because it's the Beatles working and we don't get to see that very much, and they're like the best band or the biggest band in the world, and to see that and to see them acting like human beings,
Mhm.
um and like kind of busting the myth a little bit about them, I think that's to me why I would earn a 5.
Yeah, definitely. It's a 5 for me as well. It was a very enjoyable listen. Do you prefer this to Get Back? What would be the one that you would go to back to rewatch first?
I I would watch this first because it's shorter.
Mhm.
And then if and there's some parts that weren't in Get Back, like when they do.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not, but no, I think like there's some things that weren't in Get Back. I think when don't think they did Besame Mucho in Get Back. I think they didn't
That was
include
very
that
cool.
scene,
Yeah.
which is a good one. Um, yeah, I would go back to watch this first because it's shorter. And again, it's like it was a piece of art made by the film director with the Beatles, and this is how it was intended. And you clean up the picture and you restore the audio and stuff like that. But this is how it was intended. The others,
Mhm.
Get Back is good to be like to see like it's basically the making of this movie and the making of
Yeah.
the album. And I think though, like I've gone back to watch it, I don't know where things are. Like nothing apart from like the stuff with George really stood out to me where it's like, yes, I must go
Mhm.
and watch that again. So I put it on, but yeah, this I would put on first, I think, because it's a more concise package and it's easier, and I'm more familiar with these um with the scenes, like,
Mhm.
and with what's in there, because it's something that we've seen over and over, whether it was the original release or through the anthology or video clips, that we've seen this, and so that they kind of stick in your mind. So I'd
Mhm.
go back to watch this first.
Yeah, I think I would as well. I think this is definitely a more cohesive look at these sessions that have become infamous, and we've seen so much of it in Get Back. And this is the condensed version, but it is nice to see it in a feature film format as well. So I guess it's a 5 out of 5 for us. No big surprise
Big
there
five. Yep.
for the Beatles and Let It Be, and we'll see what the band does next and what Apple releases next. But thank you, Ryan, for coming on the channel
Absolutely.
today
No,
and
this was
talking
fun.
about the Beatles. Yeah, this is super fun, and we should do this again. We could talk about because we like a lot of the same bands, whether it be the Beatles or Oasis or any of that kind of stuff. We
Yeah,
can
and all these bands are
talk
putting
about it
stuff out
forever.
at some point.
Yeah,
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 there's all these re-releases.
yeah,
They need money, I guess, so they'll
yeah,
put stuff out.
yeah, exactly. And we love talking about it. So thank you again, Ryan, for coming on the channel and talking
Thank
Beatles with
you.
me.
All right, sounds great. Thank you.